Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf samach bet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with Rav Yosef. We started yesterday's daf at the very end, and we quoted this Mishna Masechet Midot about the Bnei HaGolah. When the people came back from this to build the second temple, they expanded the size of the altar. So the big question becomes, what exactly happened here? Why did they do this? So we had a possible explanation yesterday. I say possible because Rav Yosef was the one who said it, and he's going to change his mind in today's daf. So he said it's because there was not enough room. And they said, but I said, weren't there more people in the first temple period? To which he said, well, the fire wasn't from God, so they needed more space. Things didn't get eaten as quickly. So now comes Rav Yosef and says, again, Rav Yosef changes his mind at the beginning of today's daf. Lav hainu detanya. So Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, is it not because of this following braita? Vayachinu hamizbeach al mechonotav. So this is a pasuk in Ezra, the second temple period. And they prepared the mizbeach exactly how to translate this word is a good question. What it means, mechonitav. So the Gemara says, the braita says, how do we darshan this? Shigiu lisof midotav. What it means is they figured out, okay, Rashi says, who's they? The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, okay, the Great Assembly. They figured out how big they were allowed to make the altar, as if like Shlomo couldn't figure out how big it could be, and therefore he was a little bit more cautious about how big to make it. But they figured it out, what they needed to do. To which the Gemara asked, that can't possibly be. V'aktiv, doesn't it say, Kobik tav miyad Hashem alai yiskil? The thing is written. It's written, he had the exact blueprints. Okay, this was when they built the first temple. In Chronicles, it says, and he had the exact blueprint about how to print it, how to build it. So we knew exactly the right measurements. So Elam Rav Yosef, now this is within Rav Yosef's second answer, he modifies it. So the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the Great Assembly, the people of the Great Assembly, they took a pasuk and they darshaned it, and they realized the following. So they took this pasuk, Vayomer David. David says, Ze Beit Hashem, also pasuk from Chronicles. Zeu Beit Hashem. This is the house of God, Elohim, God, our God. V'ze mizbeach le'olah liYisrael, and this is the altar for the olah for the Jews. So what did they darshan? Well, notice in this pasuk, there's two things that are comparable to each other. There's the house and there's the altar. Ki bayit, so we can build the altar like the house. Ma bayit shishima ma, just like the house, the temple, was 60 cubits in the time of Shlomo. Af mizbeach shishima ma, you can build the mizbeach up to 60 cubits. Now they built it less than 60 cubits, they built it 32, but they realized they had more space to build it bigger, so they built it bigger, they expanded it. So now the Gemara says, Bishlam abayit min karatzurato. Now we understand when they got back to the second temple, try to imagine. So you get back to the second temple and you want to rebuild it. But you need to know remember, all the areas, what's north, what's the Azara, where are the boundaries, things have to be within the Azara. How are they going to know that? Well, the house, Min Karat they could figure out the outline of where it was. Okay, they could see maybe there were some walls remaining, but Mizbeach, Menayade, but how did they know where the altar was supposed to go? So for this, we're going to have a bunch of different opinions, which is just interesting in and of itself. You can spend some time thinking about these and what the differences are between them. Amar Rabbi Elazar, ra'u mizbeach banoi u'michael asar gadol u'meida makriv alav. They saw a vision. In their vision, there was an altar, and Michael, who was one of the angels, was standing and offering sacrifices. And then they knew this is where the altar is. So they had a vision. Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha amar, efrosh shel Yitzchak ra'u shemunach bo'to makom. They didn't see anyone doing any action right now. It wasn't like that kind of vision. But what did they find? Okay, again, hard to believe. It's obviously something miraculous. They saw ashes from the Akedat Yitzchak, from when they offered up the offering in place of Yitzchak, the ram offering. They found the ashes from it, and they knew this is the spot. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, our third opinion, there was a smell of incense everywhere from when the temple had been. Misham herichu reach evarim, but there was one area where the smell was different, and they could smell like the meat burning. So they smelled the limbs, and it was a different kind of smell. And that, right, in that, obviously, right, all of these are saying, the second two anyway, that there was some remnant left. There was some sign of what there was, either the ashes from way, way, way back, we're talking way before the first temple even existed, or perhaps from the first temple, right? There was still a smell lingering in the air, and that's how they knew. Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So within this vein, we're now going to go off on a different statement that was made by in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So there were three prophets that went back with them from the exile. These are the last three prophets that were Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah. Now, each one had his role. Okay, it's kind of like in Parshat Vayera with Abraham and the three angels that come to him, and each one has a message. So one came and said, "This is the size of the altar." Okay, that's how they knew how big they could build the altar. One said, "This is where the altar is," right, relating to the two sugiyot we discussed so far. And and this relates to a sugi we saw a few dapim ago, which is one said this is where one said you can sacrifice even before you build the house. Okay, before the temple is there, this area is sanctified. You can do sacrifices here. But Matnitatan in a braita it says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Here's a bit of a different version, very similar but a little bit different. So three prophets came with them. The first one did what we said two did in the previous, about the size of the altar and where the altar is supposed to go. The second one said what the third one said in the previous. You can sacrifice even if you don't have the house yet. One doesn't seem to have all to do with the temple. The Torah is supposed to be written in the Ketav Ashurit. This is the kind of the font, you could call it, the script that the letters are written in. Okay, what are our Sifrei Torah written in? They're actually written in Ketav Ashurit, which could come from Ashur, Assyrian. Okay, it could come, some people say, from Yashal, straight, because it's much easier to read than the Ketav Ivri. The ancient Hebrew script is very hard to read. And this is much more clear, more straight. Some people say Ashurit from happy because it's much easier to read. So anyway, there's different what exactly this comes from, but it seems like it was probably from the Assyrians, their script, and that's what, or maybe. Okay, these are options, different options what it is, but it's called Ketav Ashurit, and that's what our Torahs are written from. So that's what the third prophet came to tell them. Tanu Rabbanit. Okay, so we're done with, that was just an aside we got to because of the place of the altar and the size of the altar. Now we're going to get to another braita about the altar itself. I'm going to show you some pictures today from some books that I have of the temple, or one book in particular. It's called the Encyclopedia Carta for Beta. It's called Beit HaMikdash B'Yerushalayim. Okay, this is the book. There's all different books, and they're all good for certain things. Some have better pictures in certain areas, better pictures in other things. Kind of helps to have a selection of books because if you're looking for something in particular, it's always easier to be able to see pictures, and some have better pictures than others. So Tanu Rabbanan. Keren v'kevesh v'yesod v'ribua ma'akavim. Okay, these are four parts of the altar that are essential. One is the keren. Okay, these are the big like squares that stick out at the top here. You could see one in the corner here. Okay, at the very top you get to there, and in the corner there's this big square. That's the keren. Sticks out 1 cubit. Okay, remember the mizbeach was 9 cubits in height, and then 1 more cubit of the height that the kranot jutted out of. That's essential. The kevesh, that's the ramp. This is actually a good picture of the ramp. Okay, we're going to see today. The ramp came from down there, and they would go up the ramp. It also had these side ramps. Okay, there were side ramps. You'd go up this way and get to the main ramp, and then you could go up over here. We're going to end our daf with this and get to the sovev, which is that part that goes around at mid-height. You can see there's the red of the chut hasikra, and right above that is the sovev, which is this area that was a cubit wide that jutted out a cubit, and the Kohanim would stand there when they would sprinkle the blood on the upper part of the altar. So that is essential, the ramp, the yesod, which is at the base. If you remember, it's on the north and the west side. You can always remember because it's the side where they do the slaughtering, and it's the side that's opposite the hechal on the west side. Okay, because that's always more into the room, the west side. You remember when they took the chataot chitzoniot and they came out, they poured it right in the base, right there on that western side. Viribua, it has to be square. So all those things are essential. Otherwise, the mizbeach is disqualified. Midat or ko, midat ruchbo, midat komato, emakvim. But how long, how wide, all that is not essential. Minanimile, where do we get this from? Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra, hamizbeach. Kol makom shenemar hamizbeach lakev. All these words appear next to the word hamizbeach. the altar, like Kranot HaMizbeach, the corners of the altar. El Yesod HaMizbeach. By the Kevesh, it says El Pnei HaMizbeach. And by the Ribua, it says Ravua Yiyah Mizbeach. It should be square. So the word HaMizbeach, the altar, appears next to all of these. That means it's essential. To which the Gemara said, Elameata. Well, from there, I'll tell you kind of the end first. There's this word karkov, which is talked about in the psukim, and there's a debate about what the karkov is, and also is listed with the word hamizbeach. So you're going to say, according to this, that what Rebbe holds and what Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda holds about what this karkov is, you're going to say that's essential. And they kind of think, no, it's really not. Elameata kiyor leRebbe. Kiyor is not the kiyol with an O. It's kiyor with an u. Kiyor with an O is the basin with water was. But this is kiyor, these etchings into the side of the altar. They have pictures on the altar. I did find a picture where there was some sketchings on the side of an altar. It's not here, but there I saw a picture. It wasn't the greatest picture. That's why I'm not showing it to you, but that there were engraved etchings on the side of the altar for decoration. So what? That, according to Rebbe, which he calls the karkov, that's going to be ma'akev. And the sovev, according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda's ma'akev, that sovev part I was just talking about, that's essential. Hachinami dema'akev, you think they're going to be, those are essential? Dichtiv, why would you think that? Because it says, V'natata ota tacha karkov hamizbeach milamat. And they would put that, this was something else, they would put this design thing of was made in the choshet under the karkov. And what do you see? You're the karkov of the mizbeach. So the word karkov is mentioned next to the word altar. Vitanya, and it says in a braita, Ezu karkov, Rebbe Omer Zekior. By the way, I'll show you. Okay, this is the one they're talking about now. We're going to see it later, but there, you see this white part? Okay, this is the sovev. Under it, there's this design thing here. It's very hard to see in the picture, but it's kind of like it looks goldish, but it's not. I don't think it's gold. I think it's made out of copper, but I forget exactly. But that's sort of like this design on the side, and it's at the midpoint of the altar. It's right above that red Huda Sikra that we've talked about. So now they say, what is the karkov? Rebbe Omer Zekior, that's etchings, these drawings. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Zas Sovev. It's the Sovev. You can see it's right near the Sovev there. So the Gemara says, in fact, they do think the karkov is essential. Either the etchings, according to Rebbe, and according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, the Sovev. How do we know this? This is really only going to prove Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda. Detanya, Ochoa Yom Nifgema Keren Mizbeach. Okay, we need some background. It's a very interesting story. We've talked about before about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? The Prushim and the Tzdukim. And a lot of the Kohanim were Tzdukim. And there was a big debate. One of the big central debates between the Prushim and the Tzdukim, besides we had like the big Para Aduma debate, can it be done with a Tvul Yom, if you remember? Another big one is, do you have to do Nisuch Hamayim on Sukkot, this libation of water that they would do? The rabbis really believed in it. Doesn't say so in the Torah explicitly. They darshan it from the words about all the sacrifices on Sukkot. There's different sacrifices you bring every day, and there's a mem and a yud and a mem, and they darshan this mayim, and they get to Nisuch Hamayim. And the Tzdukim didn't believe in Nisuch Hamayim. So one day, one of the Tzduki Kohanim came and just poured the water that they prepared for the libations onto the ground. And I think maybe on his feet or something. And people got really upset. They had etrogim with them, so they pelted the Tzdukim with etrogim and with stones. And because they were throwing things in the temple, what happened? Nifgema kerem mizbeach. They actually, right, with the stones, they ruined one of the corners of the altar. They broke it a little. So they made a hole in it. They viu bul shemelach v'stamu, and they took a chunk of salt and they filled it in with the salt. V'lo mipnei shekasher lavodah. It wasn't because it was going to help it be kosher for working in the temple. No, it's not kosher for working in the temple. Okay, it was broken. The salt wasn't really going to fix it. So why did they fix it then? In other words, point being, disqualified now the altar. They can't use it till they fix it. Just for the looks. They didn't want it to look like the mizbeach was blemished, was problematic. Even though it was problematic, but they didn't like the look of it in the temple. Because any altar that doesn't have those four essential things is disqualified. Comes in that braita, and this is why we brought it. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afa Sovev. He said also the Sovev, which is what he called the Karkov, and there you have it. Okay, now, just one point about the story. Obviously, it's hard to talk about the story without really pointing out what's going on here, that Here they had this whole big argument about the Nisuch HaMayim, and they thought that was so important. In the end, they ended up ruining the Mizbeach, which is crazy because the Mizbeach is such an important element in the temple, and now they couldn't even use the Mizbeach, and that was all because they thought it was so important to basically, make a big issue of the Nisuch HaMayim, and ended up ruining the altar and an inability to sacrifice sacrifices. So sometimes you lose, you get so involved in some fight over something, and you can really break something much bigger. So it's just an interesting story. An interesting story that we can learn from. Tanu Rabbanan, Ezu Karkov. So now we have another opinion about what the Karkov is. Ben keren lekeren makom hiluch raglei kohanim ama. Between the keren, now some people say that a Karkov is a groove. Okay, some people even think, okay, we're going to talk about that. It was also on the side of the altar, what I said, and there was a groove within the side of the altar. But here they say it was a groove in the ground, a place for the Kohanim to walk. Think about it. They're 10 amot off the ground. That's pretty high, right? If each amma is about 9.6. No, each is 9.6 times, 1 second. Each amma, I have to remember what an amma, 6 times, sorry, 1.6 times 6. Each amma is about 57 centimeters. So 10 amot is 570 centimeters off the ground. Okay, so it wasn't, sorry, right, sorry, 10 amot be 500, right, 570. So centimeters, I hope I'm right with my numbers now. I'm all confused. But anyway, let's just assume, yeah, be 570 centimeters off the ground. So that's pretty tall. So they were worried that the Kohanim would fall off by walking around. Also, if they're walking around to the corners of the altar, that's dangerous. So they did this groove so that they'd be a little lower down, kind of like to make a fence, so that so that they don't fall down. So that's where the Karkov is. That's a different interpretation. Achu Kohanim ben Keren lekeren avo azli. But wait, the Kohanim wouldn't walk between Keren to Keren. Now, what would they do? They walk around the altar. But if you walk around the altar on that outer rim where the kranot are, you're going to every time get to a Keren, you're going to bump into it. It wouldn't be the smartest place to walk. So what do they explain? And I'm going to show you the picture. Ela ema umakom hiluch raglei kohanim ama. What it means is that there was an amma around here. If you make a line from corner to corner, right, from all these kranot, these horns, actually they're called horns of the altar, and you made an amma all around. That's not where the Kohanim walked. That was an amma. Then if you draw a square inside, the next amma inside, you can see it's all marked off here, and it's actually gold. I don't know if you can see, it looks kind of brown. That is where there was this groove that the Kohanim would walk in. Okay, so they made this groove there so the Kohanim could walk better, and that was where they would walk. Okay, so there was an area, an amma in from the amma on the outer rim where the Kohanim would walk, and that was called the Karkov. They say v'haktiv tachar karkuvomi lamata al chetzio, but doesn't it say this? It's actually the michbal. That's what it's called. This part that I showed you, that's all gold. That looks michbar. I think it's nechoshet. It's made of maaser reshet nechoshet. It's made of copper, like a netting kind of copper. That's this picture over here. Okay, this copper part. So the Karkov is right above that. So how could you say it's the place where the Kohanim would walk if it's above the michbal on the outside of the altar at about 6 amot high? So they say, Rav Yitzchak Trehavu, there were 2 Karkovim. Chad Lenoy, one for decorations on the outside of the altar, v'chad l'kohanim delonish tarku, and one for the Kohanim so they wouldn't fall off. So that was all about the Karkov. And according to Rabbi Yosef, right, according to what we said, what defines something as ma'akev, obviously the Karkov is ma'akev, and it seems to be, right, either these etchings or according to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, the Sovev. Then we saw there was this other opinion that maybe it was that etched in, right, the ridge in the ground, or there was also this Karkov that was outside the altar, but those don't seem to contradict. It seems to be there were 2 of them. Now we get to this line, midat or ko, midat ruchbo, midat komato em akvin, right? Whatever size it is, it's not essential. I'm a Rabbi Mary, many. As long as you don't do it any smaller than the altar that Moshe had. So now we want to know, obviously, how big was the altar that Moshe had? Now you could just open up a Chumash and look, but we are in the Gemara, so we're going to hear Rav Yosef. I'm Rav Yosef, it was 1 cubit. Now it sounds like he's saying 1 by 1 by 1 cubit. Now, Gemara tells us that the rabbi started mocking him and saying, Chamesh amot orech, v'chamesh amot rochav revua yam mizbech. What are you talking about? In the Torah, it says explicitly, it's 5 cubits by 5 cubits, and it's a square. You You can't say it's 1 cubit by 1 cubit. What is that, Rav Yosef? So comes Abaye to Rav Yosef's rescue. If you remember, when Rav Yosef got older, he was a little forgetful, so maybe he forgot. I don't know. Well, Amarle Abaye. Dilma makom marachaka amar. Maybe what you meant was the place of the maracha where the fire would be on the mizbeach of Moshe. Now here it works perfectly because the mizbeach was 5 by 5. Each of the corners takes up 1 cubit. So now if you have a square, so each on every side you're going to have two horns. So you're going to have to take away 2 cubits, right? Because on the length you have 1 and 1. So take away 2 cubits, you now have a space of 3 by 3. Within that 3 by 3, you need an amma for the kohanim to walk around. So that's 1 amma on each side. That takes away another 2, and you're left with 1 by 1. That's perfect square of what Rav Yosef must have been talking about, to which Rav Yosef says, Amar le Mar Gavar Rabahu. Wow, you're a really smart person. Yada Mai Kamina, you understood me. You're the only one who understood me. Kare Alayo, and I'm going to call the rest of those students who were mocking me B'nai Keturah. They were like the sons of Avram, the Havith Keturah, one of his Pilakshim, Pilak Shot, and, one of his extra wives. And, you're outsiders, basically. Okay. Now, because we're already bringing up this insult of calling people B'nai Keturah, now we're going to say B'nai Avte to Rabbi Tarfon. There was another story of the sons, the nephews of Rabbi Tarfon, Haviyat v'Kamei to Rabbi Tarfon. They were sitting in front of Rabbi Tarfon, and he wasn't so pleased with them, okay? And he was trying to get them to talk. They weren't talking. They weren't saying anything. So he wanted to get them to talk. So what did he do? Patach v'amal v'Yosef Avraham v'Yikach Isha. Actually, I don't think she was a Pilegesh, I should say. I don't think she was a concubine. I think she was actually really a wife. So sorry that I said she was a concubine. V'Yosef Avraham v'Yikach Isha. He took another wife. This is much later. Ushma Yochani. And her name is Yochani. What would I say? I challenge you to go open a Chumash and find this pasuk. It doesn't exist. What was he trying to do? He was trying to get them to talk because they weren't talking in Shiur. They were just silent. So he says her name is Yochani, which totally wasn't. Amrele, they said to him, Keturah Ktiv. What do you mean? Her name is Keturah. It wasn't Yochani. Kari alehem b'nei Keturah. So he said, you guys are the sons of Keturah. Okay? Again, an insult to people saying, you don't really belong here, or you're not really such good students. Amar Abaye Bar Huna, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria. Gezirin Shasa Moshe. So first we talked about how big the altar was at Moshe's time, because we need to know, because our altar has to be bigger. Now, what about these Gezirin? What are the Gezirin? Well, there was one of the avodot in the Mikdash was to set up 2 pieces of wood, this says so in the Torah, for the Korban Tamid, once in the morning and another 2 in the afternoon. And it was one of the avodot of the Kohanim. So these Gezirin Shasam Moshe, how long were they? How big were they in the time of Moshe? Remember, his whole fire, right? The place where the fire would go was 1 by 1 cubit. It was much bigger in the time of the temple, right? You can see it in this picture. There's actually probably better pictures of it, but anyway, let's see, whatever. Anyway, and we'll look for another time. But it says the Gezirin were Orkanama v'Rochbanama. They were 1 by 1 cubit, v'Ovyan kemachak godesh se'ah. And their thickness was like an implement that we use to flatten out of flour. Okay, that's like usually a flat thing that's used to flatten out things. It's not very thick. So they were 1 by 1 length and width, and very, thin. Rabbi Yirmiyah ba'amagduma. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says they were actually like a little less than a cubit, because you didn't want it to jut out and get in the way of the kohanim. Remember, the altar was pretty small, and there was the amma that the kohanim walked around, and then which was 1 amma all around that one small amma. You didn't want them jutting out at all, so it was a little less. Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says, "V'lav hainu detanya." Now, unclear here whether he's actually bringing a support for Rabbi Yirmiyah. Doesn't it say here in a braita to support you, or it doesn't say here in a braita against you? Okay, there's a few different interpretations here. Also, there's different interpretations of what Rabbi Yirmiyah really means when he says geduma. And there's different girsaot also what word, but let's just go with Rabbi Yirmiyah says that they were smaller. And then Rav Yosef says, but doesn't it say in a braita, right on the wood that's on the fire, that's on the altar, that's the wood we're talking about. The fact that it says the wood is on the fire, on the altar, they can't jut out at all, which might mean, though, that they could be exactly 1 by 1, not smaller like you said, or maybe the opposite. They can't jut out, so yeah, they were smaller. You're right, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Tnanatam, another Mishna from Midot. So we had this big ramp. It was on the south side of the altar. Orech 32 al rochav 16. It was 16 amot wide. By the way, it's really big. That's like the size of the Reshut HaRabim is 16 cubits wide. Okay, that's pretty big. And the length is double that, 32. It's a very big altar. Menahanimile, how do we get that the kevesh was on the south side? Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'shachat oto al yerach hamizbeach tzafona. The shechita is on the northern side. And what do you see here? The yerach hamizbeach, the foot of the altar, is on the north side. So that would mean that the head of it, which is the ramp, shehei yerach b'tzafon, upanav b'darom, that the face of it must be, meaning where you're going up the ramp, must be on the south side. So they say, Ema yerach b'tzafon upanav b'tzafon. Maybe the arech, right, the leg of it, the back of it is in the north, and also the ramp is in the north. So Amarava, Rame Gavra. No, it's like a person. If a person lies down, what happens? Their face is on one side, their legs are on the other side, like the altar. The yerech, or like the legs, are on the back side, and the other part is on the front side. The ramp is the face of it. So Amarle Abaye, here we have a discussion between Rav and Abaye. Often we have a debates between them. They're not always talking. Here we have them conversing. Adrabah, taritz votiv gavra. You could say, maybe straighten up the person and have them sitting, and then their face and their legs are facing the same way. And maybe that's the altar. The end of the altar and the ramp are on the same side, on the north. Not to mention that would be a little complicated because we do all the slaughtering on the north for the Kodesh Kodeshim. I don't know how you'd have room also for this big long ramp and also to have slaughter all these sacrifices. But Abaye seems to suggest maybe it's that way. Amalei Ravua Ktiv. Rava says it says Ravua, and Ravua in Aramaic is also Ravutz, which is to crouch. So crouching sounds like they're lying. V'hai mibaile demirba Rabue, but don't you need Ravua to say it's square and not to say it's crouching? Miktiv miruba, right? This is the back and forth between Rav and Abaye. So Rava says it doesn't say miruba, square, it says Ravua. Ravua teaches you Ravutz. Filitamech miktiv ravutz. He says, doesn't say ravutz, it says ravua, Abaye says. Amalei, ravua ktiv, demashmach, umashmach. He says, yes, it says ravua. And ravua could be ravutz, and it could be also ribua. It means both. The fact that it chooses that way to say it says you can learn both, and that's where Rava gets that it's a person crouching, like lying down, and the altar basically has the end of it on the north and the entrance to it on the south. V'tana ma'itela mehacha. Different Tana brings it from a different source. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, uma aloteu pinot kadim, and it's the steps going up turns east. What do we learn from this? Kol pinot she'ata poneh lo yu ela derech yamin lamizrach. Every step you take and everywhere you turn on the altar, it's always toward the right. Now this is a little bit strange because we're going to say it like this: you go up from the south, you walk up the ramp, and then you turn right. Now right is toward the east. So that makes sense. But as soon as you finish turning right, now you want to go to the other corners, you're going to go left. So what it really means is you start yamin and then you go counterclockwise. That's really what it's saying. It's saying counterclockwise, right? We say clockwise, counterclockwise. What this means, when you're on the altar, you're always going counterclockwise. So they learn it from this word, the pnot kadim, you're facing the east. So if you're facing the east, well, that means when you're walking up the south, you're going to turn east, and you're going to turn right, and you're going to turn east. So because that's yamin lamizrach. So they say ve'ema small lamizrach, who says you have to turn right to the east. Maybe you turn left to the east, and then the ramp would be on the north side, and then you go up. And if you want to get to east, you turn left. So they say lo sakadatach. Doesn't make sense to say that because Tana Rami Bar Yecheskel says yam sha'asa Shlomo. We're now going to learn it from the basin. Now the base of the basin, they describe it in the time of Shlomo like this. Omed al shnei masar bakal. It was standing on the base of it. Okay, you can find pictures of this also. The base of the basin had these animals. Okay, it was like these depictions of animals like facing. Okay, we're going to see them. Sorry, I didn't get to the pages of all these things. Okay, but anyway, there's pictures and you can find them online also if you look up. Well, most of these things are online in different places. You can look up under images and try to put these words in, especially if you use them in Hebrew. More likely you'll find, but maybe even in English. Although it'll be hard. You won't be able to look for basin. So, Omer al shnei masar bakar, shlosha ponim tzafona. So there were 12 cattle there. 3 were turning north. Shlosha ponim yama. 3 were turning west. Shlosha ponim negva. 3 were turning south. And shlosha ponim mizracha. Now, if you go from north to west to east to south to east, you're going counterclockwise. So that's how they show. Here's the order. So they say, what do you learn from here? Kol pinot shata poneh lo yu ela derech yamin lemizrach. It's always going east to the right to the east, which again means counterclockwise. So they say, what do you mean? No, that pasuk describing the kior had to describe the base of the basin, and it had to say there were three on this side, three on that side, three on that side. Why are you assuming it's talking about how you're supposed to turn when you're in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple? So they say, ponim lamali. Why do they keep saying these are ponim this way, and these are ponim that way, and these are ponim that way? Could you say there's three turning north, and facing north, and three west, and three south, and three east? You didn't have to say ponim each time. It would be obvious you meant that. Why does it keep saying ponim, which means they're facing? But it also means when you turn, right? That's what we just said. Kol pinot shata poneh. Every time you turn at the corner, it's also the same root, and that's where they learn it. The fact that it says it 4 times there. Okay. Sha'al Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya, Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Shimon, son of Yossi ben Lakunya, asked Rabbi Yossi the following question: Omer ya Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, avir yesh ben kevesh lemizbech. Did you hear this crazy thing? Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said there was space between the ramp and the altar. When you got up the ramp, before you got to the altar, you would think the ramp attached to the altar. But I heard, and did you ever hear this? That Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said there was a space there. There was a gap. Okay, like mind the gap on the subway, right? There was a gap there. So Amar Lo, so Rabbi Yossi says to him, what, you don't think so? It's obvious there was a gap. Why? Halok farne'emal v'asita olotecha basar v'adam. It says, do your korbanot olah, your offerings, your burnt offerings, the meat and the blood. So why say the meat and the blood together? We want to compare them. Madam bizrika, af basar bizrika. Just like you have to throw the blood, they would stand at the bottom of the base, right at the bottom of the altar, and they would throw it onto the corners of the altar. Also, the meat has to be thrown. Thrown from where? Well, they carry it up the ramp, and then when they get to the top of the ramp, they throw it because there's this gap there. So they throw the meat. Hard to imagine this. Anyway, Amar Lo, so Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya says to him, Shani Omel, Omei B'tzar Machar V'Zorek. What do you mean? You could be standing on the top of the altar next to where the fire is, and you can throw it. And maybe it means when you're there, you throw it in, just like when the blood goes on the altar. Here it goes on the fire on the altar. Maybe that's what it means. So Amar Lo, Rabbi says, you don't need a puzzle to tell me that. That's just obvious you're going to throw it onto the fire. Why? Well, Kishu Zorek, when he throws it onto the maracha, where the wood is, l'maracha delukau zorek, does he throw it on a fire that's going? Or olamaracha she'ena delukau zorek, or is he throwing it on an unlit fire, just a pile of wood? Obviously, have omer l'maracha delukau zorek. You're obviously throwing on a pile of wood full of fire going there. So Hata mishum delo efshar. The reason why you throw it there is because there's no other way to do it. You're not going to place it down when there's a big blazing fire going on. So you don't need a pasuk to teach me that. So if the basar is teaching you, the habasar v'adam is teaching you, if the meat is thrown just like the blood, it must be thrown from the ramp onto the altar. Rav Papa gives a different way to understand that drasha, and also getting to the same idea. Kidam, it has to be like the blood. Now, madam, avir karka mafsiko. When you're throwing it from the bottom, you throw it onto the altar, there's airspace in between you, that basically there's ground in between you and the altar. So you throw it and the blood goes kind of through the air, and under it is just ground. So af basal, same thing with the basal. Avir karka mafsiko. When you throw it, there's ground underneath you. Now we're going to see in a minute, it's not exactly true there's ground underneath you, but there is a gap. And it's not right straight going onto the altar. There's a gap there where there's some airspace below. We're going to see there's actually something that fills in that space a little bit lower down, but there is still some airspace, just you're not going to actually get to the ground. And that's because of this next line. Amar Rav Yehuda, Shnei kfashim ktanim yotzim min hakevesh. There's 2 smaller ramps coming out of the altar. So we're going to see them right now. Okay, I'll show you 2 pictures so you can see it well. So here's a side ramp. You see that white going there? There's the big ramp, and here's a side ramp, and it goes up to the sovev. Okay, to get to the sovev, you can't get to the sovev from the big ramp, because the big ramp leads you up to the very top. How do you get to that sovev, which is, a little over the midpoint? You're going to need to take that side ramp. Okay, now you can see here the side ramp. On one side, it actually went straight up from parallel to the ramp. But here, there's one that goes to the side and then goes halfway up, and then it goes across the other way. There's like a double ramp. I don't know if you could hear. Now you can see it better. Okay. So these 2 kfashim that went up, behem ponim la yisod ula sovev. It gets you also to the yisod, that base at the bottom of the altar, and also to the sovev. Umuvdalim in hamizbeach meloni ma. And also there was a little bit of a gap. Shenemal saviv. How do we know? Because it says saviv. Now, saviv means that you have to be able to get to the altar and go all around it without anything attached to it. So those ramps couldn't have been attached, not to the sovev, not to the mizbech. There had to be a little bit of a gap. They said this was like a hair's breadth, like very small. Whether the big one had it really small or maybe a little bigger than that, but there's machloket about that. Rabbi Yehuda, Ravua, he proves it from the fact that it says it's square. Now, if the ramp went all the way up to the altar, it wouldn't be square because it would be, right? It would be a shape like a square, but on one side of the square, it's attached to this kind of slide going down. You wouldn't call that square. So istrich lemichtav saviv, istrich lemichtav ravua. Why did you need around and also square? Well, ikatav rachmana saviv hava mina da'agil ma'agal. Said you have to be able to go around. Well, that would mean maybe the whole thing was rounded, okay? And it's not. Therefore, katav rachmana ravua, that you learn it was square. Ikatav rachmana ravua, if you said square, hava mina da'arach v'katin, you might have thought it's rectangular because you could call ravua. It's really just a four-sided object. Could have been rectangular, and that's why it says saviv to know its equal sides. Tanan hatam, and here we're going to get to where exactly how the ramp worked. Or we'll see the sizes. Hakevesh b'mizbeach shishim u'shtayim. This is our last part for today. The ramp in the altar is 62 cubits. Now, let's do the math. We said the altar was 32 by 32, and we said the ramp was 32 in length. 32 plus 32 is 64, not 62. So they say, Hane shitim va'arba'ahavu, that should be 64, not 62. Well, nimtza porech amal yesov va'amal asavev. And this goes back to what we saw yesterday with all the sizes. So the sovev jutted out one amah, and the yesod jutted out also another amah. Now, when the ramp went up 32, two of those cubits of the altar, it overlapped over. In other words, it goes up to the altar, but the altar on the side where underneath it is the sovev one amah, and underneath it is the yesod. And actually, the yesod isn't really under there, but the yesod is on the other side. But theoretically, what we're saying is it was distanced 2 cubits really from the altar because the sovev, if you count the 2 cubits of the altar, which are those extra ones, the sovev and the yesod, are basically underneath the ramp. And that's how we lose 2 cubits of space and we get to only 62. Okay, that's it for today. But let's just review. We started with why was the altar bigger in the second temple, and we had the second explanation of Rav Yosef about they finally understood what measurement they could make it, and they did this drasha. In the end, we explained about the bayit. It could be like the bayit, which could be up to 60 cubits, even though they didn't build it that big. Then we had all these things. How'd they know where the altar was supposed to go? How'd they know the size? And the prophets must have helped them in some way. Or we had these other explanations of things that they found there that were kind of miraculous. It smells, aromas were still there. They saw an image of an angel giving sacrifices, or they saw the ashes from the Akedah. Okay, then we had the parts of the altar that are essential. We had the keren, the kevesh, the yesod, the ribua. Then we added the karkov, because that was also mentioned near the word hamizbech. We saw different explanations of what the karkov is. Then we talked about the measurements aren't critical, but it has to be bigger than Moshe. How big was Moshe's? 5 by 5. We talked about how we got to the different sizes there. We had the insults of the Bnei Keturah. That was part of the people who made fun of Rav Yosef for saying it was one amah when he really meant the part where the fire was going, not the whole altar. And then we talked about the gzirin of Moshe, that were those two wooden pieces to burn the tamid each day, right? Twice a day. They were 1 by 1, maybe 1 by 1, a little less than 1 by 1. We had a debate about that. Then we got to the fact that where you turn when you go, right? You always go to the right, which we mean counterclockwise. And then we had the last thing about the space between the kevesh and the altar and the different ramps that there were, the side smaller ramps, and what the purpose of them was, how we know that there was also a space, a little bit of a gap between there, and all the gaps that we discussed at the end of the daf. With that, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shabbat.